let's make a start. Grab a seat. Thanks for coming today. I'm going to talk about the evils of dirt and the value of cleanliness. So I'm going to talk today about what was life like in Manchester in the 1840s, what the reasons are behind the fact that the Manchester Corporation didn't take up building baths and washhouses until the 1870s, and in relation to that, how the baths and washhouses that were in existence at that time, in that 30 years, did come into existence. And there's going to then be a little bit of a detour into public finances before I come back to the evils of dirt and the value of cleanliness. So just as a rough outline, if I go off on one, it'll come back to baths and washhouses eventually. So just bear with me. Thanks. So the Manchester Guardian reports on the 23rd of August in 1878 that, quote, "An inquiry was held yesterday morning at the town hall in the city before Mr. J. Smith, CE Local Government Board Inspector, relative to the application of the City Council to the Local Government Board for the sanction to borrow £50,000 for the purposes of Baths and Washhouses Acts." Hello, come on in. So the article goes into more detail as to who was there and what was discussed, but what's interesting for me is that it was 1878 that Manchester Corporation finally took up the building of baths and washhouses, when really legislation had been in place since the 1840s. So why did it take so long for Manchester to start building baths and washhouses when other corporations were already doing this? So like I said, I will start with why the early baths and washhouses were built, who built them, and how they were financed, and then talk a little bit about public health and public health finance at the time, to then come back to the value of dirt and the evil of cleanliness. Hi Danny, what time do you call this? So I'll start with what was life like in Manchester in the 1840s, so why were the baths built in the first place? There's a seat just at the front. There's two over there.
Thank you.
So what was life like in Manchester in the 1840s? One is the physical environment. So this picture, I don't know, can you see this okay? Picture of Ancoats gives you a pretty good illustration of what the physical environment was like in the city in the 1840s. We also have descriptive reports, one of which is an 1844 report by Monsieur Faucher, who visited Manchester at the time and then wrote a book for the French market. So I'll read a little section from...
I think I'm retracting the view. It's good. Okay. Thank you.
So I'll just read a little bit about what Monsieur Faucher has to say about Manchester. Manchester, which holds under its sway these industrial agglomerations, is itself an agglomeration, the most extraordinary, the most interesting, and in some respects the most monstrous, which the progress of society has presented. The first impression is far from favourable. Its position is devoid of picturesque relief and the horizon of clearness. Amid the fogs which exhale from its marshy districts and the clouds of smoke vomited forth from numberless chimneys, labour presents a mysterious activity somewhat akin to the subterraneous actions of a volcano. There are no great boulevards or heights to aid the eye in measuring the vast extent of surface which it occupies. It is distinguished neither by those contrasting features which mark the cities of the Middle Ages, nor by the regularity which characterizes the capitals of recent formation. All the houses, all the streets resemble each other, and yet this uniformity is in the midst of confusion. On closer examination, however, a certain approximation of order is apparent. Manchester is situated at the confluence of the Little River, the Irwell, swollen by the waters of the Irk, and a brook called the Medlock. The Irwell separates Manchester from its principal suburb, the Old Town, which has given its name to the hundred of Salford. On the left bank of the river is another suburb, Chorlton upon Medlock, which in 1801 numbered only 675 inhabitants, and which now contains 30,000. The manufactories and machine shops form, as it were, a girdle around the town and follow the courses of the streams. Factories, 7 stories in height, rear their lofty fronts along the banks of the Irwell, along the borders of canals, which, penetrating into the town, form an interior navigation. The waters of the Irk, black and fetid as they are, supply numerous tanneries and dye works. Those of the Medlock supply calico printing establishments, machine shops and foundries. At the same year, 1844, Friedrich Engels visited Manchester and wrote his famous book, The Condition of the Working Classes. He describes what he found at the first section of the book, and I'm going to read an extract from where he talks about Dookie Bridge, which is not really in existence anymore because the River Irk has just been paved over, basically. So he's talking about Dookie Bridge, which is in the area of Noma now, near Corporation Street. There's 2 seats there and there, if you want to sit at the front. So he says, above Dookie Bridge, the left bank grows more flat and the right bank steeper, but the condition of the dwellings on both banks grows worse rather than better. Whoever turns to the left here from the main street, Long Millgate, is lost. He wanders from one court to another, turns countless corners, passes nothing but narrow, filthy nooks and alleys, until after a few minutes he has lost all cloe and knows not whither to turn. Everywhere half or wholly ruined buildings, some of which actually uninhabited, which means a great deal here. Rarely a wooden or stone floor to be seen in the houses, almost uniformly broken, ill-fitting windows and doors, and a state of filth. Everywhere heaps of debris, refuse and offal, standing pools for gutters, and a stench which alone would make it impossible for a human being in any degree civilized to live in such a district. So I have a couple of pictures of Long Millgate, so the street that he's talking about. And you can see that it doesn't actually look too bad in the illustrations. I love that the person is the same size as the horse in this one. But one of the things that's important to remember is that these are definitely sanitized illustrations. So the streets would not have looked like this. They would not have had a pavement. They're more likely to not have a pavement, and it wouldn't have been paved. So all of this would have been covered in mud and most likely rubbish as well. This is a view of some of the houses. So you can see that they're kind of fallen down. Can you see this okay? Okay. So you can see that they're kind of falling down, but also that Long Millgate's street front was quite uniform in a way. So it was one of those streets that would create a way into the city from the suburbs for the rich people to just kind of get in their horse-drawn carriages and travel into the city and not engage and not see what was behind. So these were kind of hiding street front. This is much later, so you can see that the houses are actually a lot worse. But people were living in these and in the slums behind it, and the slum areas behind it would have been much worse than the street out the front. And one of the reasons why the slums were so bad was because there was too many people coming too quickly to kind of keep up with building, and the rapid immigration. I'm going to talk about rapid immigration next, but one of the things that we have to remember is that the conditions that we are used to from like Dickens novels, for example, or Dickens adaptations, Hard Times and things like that, are in a way accurate, but probably a lot worse. So people would have lived in much worse conditions than is described. I remember reading one of the accounts from one of the missionaries who visited the districts like Little Gibraltar, which is what's behind these, and thinking about it still 3 days later, because it was just pretty horrible to imagine that people would live in that state. But I'll actually quote some of that, and then I can talk about more of it in a bit. So the fact that too many people came too quickly in the city was partly why the state of things was so bad. Manchester grew incredibly rapidly in the start of the 19th century. So in 1788, the population was 43,000. In 1801, it was 75,000. And in 1851, it was 300,000. So you can see that's an exponential rise. We can also compare that to the number of warehouses. So in 1820, there were 126 warehouses in the city, and only 9 years later, there were over 1,000. So you can see how that just kind of mushroomed out of nowhere almost. And the factories, so this is a twist factory on Oxford Street, would just kind of be built at a completely alarming rate, and then slum housing was thrown up around the areas to house the workers, to keep the factories running about 24 hours a day. Have you got your dog? Okay. There's some argument amongst historians as to why people came into the city when it was so filthy and horrible and ugly. Economic historian Geoffrey Williamson makes the case that workers went where the jobs were, and that we know that wages in the cities were much higher than in the countryside. There's some idea that the wages were that high to kind of compensate the workers to living in these horrible conditions. And there's also evidence that workers were trying to save on the expensive rents in the city by living in smaller quarters. So you would have one family per room, because the rents were really high, because there was a lack of space. So that was a choice initially, but later on in the late 30s and the early 40s, there was an economic depression, and you would get a lot of, even 2 families huddled in one cellar dwelling. So you'd have over a dozen people in one room, because they just couldn't afford to move anywhere else. So a cellar dwelling looked like this. And this is, again, quite a doctored version, I think, because these people actually have furniture. And there's a seat to the front if you want to come and sit. That's okay. So these people actually have furniture, which later on is actually pretty unlikely. Most of the inhabitants wouldn't really have possessions. A lot of them would have pawned their clothes for food, and they're unlikely to get it back once they get their poor relief. So the Corn Laws also created artificially high prices for food, so people would just be starving and mostly naked, living in really damp cellar dwellings like these ones. Oh, no. Well, we'll come to him. But the missionaries at the time were going into the cellar dwellings and into the slums to give relief to people. So people would get the poor relief, and they would be given it by missionaries who wanted to check out what was going on, and also collect information for government reports as to the conditions of the towns. So this was happening all over the country. One missionary report is by Joseph Atchett. So I'll just read you a bit of what he found in one of the dwellings in 1842. The above ground habitations of the indignant poor are little better than the cellars, except in the matter of situation. Nothing in the shape of the meanest comforts of life are visible in them. Decent furniture there is none. Bricks, logs of wood, and other contrivances were being frequently used as substitutes for tables and chairs, while the bags of shavings or other litter of straw was laid in some corner to be occupied nightly by its miserable tenants, with its accumulation of impurities inevitably resulting from the condition and habits of the latter. And not always are those abodes of squalor and poverty, whether cellars or ground floor habitations, occupied by members of one family alone. Frequently, different families occupy opposite corners of the same room, the sexes being no further separated than by a few feet of space which lie between their beds of straw. This state of things has come under my observation repeatedly in visiting the habitations of the poor. 6 or 8 persons have I witnessed inhabiting a damp cellar, males and females congregated together, with a line hung along the hovel for the use of inmates, upon which were suspended indiscriminately their torn and dirty apparel, with other scenes of a nature too disgusting for recital. So leave that to your imagination. Now, naturally, all of those, there's still one seat there and one seat here if you want to sit. Naturally, all of those conditions would create health hazards as we understand them now. So there were quite a lot of consequences for your health depending on who you were and where you were on the social stratum at this time. There was an obvious lack of general hygiene. There's also the fact that there were appalling working conditions. There was relatively bad food being consumed. And there was, of course, really high child mortality. So the average life expectancy of a working class factory hand in Manchester in the 1840s was 16. If you were working in a shop, you had a slightly better shot at average age being 20. So that gives you kind of an idea of what people were dealing with in a way and how the situation really needed to improve. So I'll talk a little bit more about the health consequences and how that impacted sanitary reform. The sanitary reformers were mostly focusing on combating contagious waterborne disease like typhoid or cholera. You could be cynical and say that they were trying to contain these diseases because they could spread to the rich, unlike something like consumption, which is much more localized and related to overcrowding. So Edwin Chadwick, who's here, wrote a report in 1842 called The Report on the Sanitary Conditions of the Labouring Population of Great Britain, which focused on drainage, sewage and water supply, which were the main priorities of the sanitary reformers. He sent abridged versions of this report to about 2,000 people all over the country, highlighting a problem to the middle classes that they'd not really been aware of before because they'd not really been in contact with the slum conditions of the workers that they were employing. So the report focused on improving drainage and sewage mostly, and also the changing legislation to do with sanitation. Cholera swept through Britain in the late 40s again for the second time, and it caused a panic because people didn't really know how the disease was spread. So they knew it had something to do with water, but they didn't know how and they didn't know why. And they were still convinced that bad smells caused disease. So the miasm theory of disease was still very prevalent until much later in the century. So I think there was a London study where it was conclusively proven that bad water and that there was bacterial involvement in cholera was the 1870s, I think. So until then, all they had was anecdotal evidence. So they didn't really have that much to go on, and they could just figure out, okay, so if we can figure out how to deal with this dirty water, then maybe we can try and not have people get sick so much. Chadwick's report influenced the Public Health Act of 1848, but apart from that, not much else happened directly as a consequence. So we have public health legislation in place. We also have bath and wash houses legislation in place. So why didn't Manchester do anything about it? So I'm going to talk a bit more about the bath and wash houses that did exist in Manchester in the 40s and 50s, and then try and answer the questions to why it didn't happen. So Manchester became incorporated in 1838, and the area is that black area there, So the area around the outside is Manchester 100 years later, so in the 1930s. So you can see that the incorporated Manchester was actually quite small compared to what we are now understand as the city of Manchester. So Withington, Rusholme, Moss Side and Chorlton, for example, were not part of the municipality. They all had their own little local governments. So the fact that it was so small also had an impact on how it was run. But also, let's not forget that public health and the public affairs were administered. It was a really new thing to happen, so it was administered by committees. So Manchester only got incorporated in 1938. They didn't really know how this would work, and then suddenly you have 10 times the population, and you don't really know what to do with them. So it's partly the fact that it was all new, they didn't really know what to do, and that everything happened so quickly. And that the fact that it was a huge health problem suddenly required state intervention, which it didn't before, because there were so many people. And this situation was not something that the Victorians, the early Victorians certainly kind of knew what to do with. They were just getting in their stride, and everything gets better by the turn of the century. But in the early third of the century, it wasn't that great. So once they even decided to do something about the public health problems and about the appalling conditions of things, they still argued about what that best thing to do would be and how to do it. The other thing that happened, it wasn't just public health that changed, it was also the administration of justice, it was the administration of labour, so everything really changed. And baths and washhouses and kind of general sanitation are only a small part of this, and we can't really see it outside of that context. The fact that everything kind of just was administered rather inefficiently because they were just completely overwhelmed was part of the reason why even 10 years afterwards not much as had happened. So the situations were still bad, even with legislation and change in place. So what the 1848 Act did was to create boards of health, like a general board of health. So you had a board of health that would deal with the nation. And it encouraged local authorities to set up local boards of health. Now, a board of health in order for a board of health to be established, 1/10 of ratepayers were required to petition to create a board of health. Also, where a mortality rate was exceeding an average of 23 per 1,000 over the preceding 7 years, the Board of Health would be created mandatorily. These boards were obliged to appoint a surveyor, maintain streets, construct and maintain sewers, inspect properties so that owners and occupiers clean, drain and provide water at their properties. Manchester did not set up a Board of Health. Manchester and Liverpool made private statutory arrangements concerning public health. And this is where the Manchester Police Regulation Act of 1844 comes in. So the Manchester Police Regulation Act requires house owners to provide a fit and proper privy for the people living in the houses. And yet it was only to be emptied and cleared as the council may see fit, without actually explaining what that means. So the legislation around public health at this time, even in Manchester, was kind of lacking teeth, and it wasn't really that easy for inspectors to force homeowners to do something about the situation of their properties. So Manchester also it was suspicious of the central government. They didn't think it was necessary for central government to fiddle with their affairs, if you like. And even the town clerk went down to London to tell them that actually we're doing fine, thanks. Manchester itself was doing something about sanitation itself, and one of those things was the Manchester Corporation Waterworks Act, which created a connection between the Longdale Reservoir and Manchester. So you can see here a map of, this is a much later map, so this is not exactly how big it turned as it was at the start. But you can see that from the reservoir all the way across to Manchester and how the profile looked. So it was a huge, it took about 10 years to complete. And the Manchester Corporation paid for a lot of this with the gas profits from the gasworks. And it supplies water to Manchester to this day. Yes, and also the other thing to bear in mind is that for the municipality, public health wasn't really a priority. It was much more important for them to have well-lit streets, clean streets, a marketplace, and a rail service, yes, a rail service, which they were spending a lot of money on. So public health and baths were not really that high on the priority list. The same is true, like I said, for baths and wash houses. The municipal corporation had no interest or capacity to provide baths and wash houses at the time. So it was up to local individuals to try and improve the situation. So the first establishment of baths and wash houses was opened on the 9th of September 1846, so almost exactly 170 years ago today, on Miller Street in New Cross by a private baths and wash houses committee. The only thing, we don't have a picture of it, so the only thing we have is a map. So you can see it's on Miller Street and Corporation Street, I think it's just across here now. You can just see a little map. This was an experimental establishment where the Baths and Wash Houses Committee found a house to then transform into baths and wash houses. So they didn't purpose-built it. And I'll read you a little bit of the opening of the committee to explain what was there. So the Committee for the Establishment of Baths and Wash Houses in Manchester have the pleasure of announcing to those interested in the amelioration of the physical and social condition of the labouring classes that the premises on Miller Street are now open for the use of the people. During the week which has elapsed since the opening of the establishment, great numbers have availed themselves in the advantages afforded, and there's every prospect of extensive usefulness. There are 18 baths, each has a separate compartment, and quite private, fitted up with a seat, hooks for clothes, a looking glass, and taps by which hot and cold water may be turned on at pleasure. The charge for each bath is 2d, inclusive of a towel. Of those baths, 6 on the first floor are appropriately exclusively for females, and 12 on the second floor for males. They have separate entrances and waiting rooms. There is also one bath with rather superior fittings, for the use of which 6d is charged. So it's no coincidence that these provisions are recommended in the Baths and Wash Houses Act. So 2 different kinds of baths with 2 different kinds of people. Yet I would imagine that having a bath, even for 2d, was a luxury for somebody who couldn't get only water from a tap down the street. Miller Street, as well as the 4 public baths that would follow in Manchester in the next 30 years, was primarily run as a business. And they were almost immediately at a loss. So one of the problems that Miller Street had that was because they didn't have a reliable water supply, because Manchester wasn't connected to the grid yet. They could only use springs, and they would use springs to fill up cisterns to then heat up the water for the baths. Now the problem was that the water level would only rise enough to fill up the springs twice a day. So they were losing a lot of business because they just didn't have enough water, and one of the first things that they did was petition for more money to buy bigger cisterns. They also were set up by what's called a subscription model. So they raised funds by holding a fancy dress ball and receiving donations, but also a subscriptions model. And I'm not exactly sure what you would get if you subscribed to the Baths and Wash Houses, if you would get access to it, or if you would get I don't know, a cookie, I'm not sure. We don't know yet. On Sycamore Street in 1850, so 4 years later on the Haywood estate in Miles Platting. And it was opened by local banker Benjamin Haywood, who built an entire estate. I don't know if you know about this. He built an entire estate with houses and a school and a bath and wash house in Miles Platting for the handloom weavers. And this is the first purpose-built baths house in Manchester. And David Winstanley, who was the manager of the estate, wrote to Samuel Robertson in London to inquire about some of the details of the baths and wash houses. Because at that time, the Golston Square baths and wash houses were built as a model establishment. One of the things that we take for granted, so we think, oh yeah, there's lots of baths and wash houses, we know how to build them, it's cool. But at this time, they didn't know how it would all work, like what materials to use, how much money they needed. So P.P. Barley was working on some plans for some model bathhouses to then send out to municipalities or people interested in building them. So this is a 8,500 baths and wash house. So you can see the slipper baths on the side, 2 plunge pools, second class slipper baths on that side, changing rooms, and this is a laundry at the top. So it's quite big. And we have another one. So yes, this is a detail. This is just the bathtubs and how it would look. And this is a smaller one for about £4,000. So here you can see again, smaller number of baths, 1 plunge pool, smaller number of second class baths with another laundry at the top. And these would then be distributed to anyone interested on how to build a bathhouse. One of the exciting things about the Sycamore Street baths is that I had what's called a plunge pool. So whilst this was quite small, 9 yards by 6 yards, so about 8 meters by 5.5 meters, it was extremely popular. People would just go swimming and playing in it all day if they could. I have a picture of Mayfield Baths plunge pool, which was taken a few years later, and Sycamore Street wouldn't have looked this big or this luxurious, but you kind of get the idea. It's very much like upstairs, the pool's upstairs. You could stay there for 2p all day, and I'm going to read you a little report from E.T. Bellhouse of the Manchester Statistical Society, and then talk a little bit more about the plunge pool. So E.T. Bellhouse says, "The plunge bath is in great request, and it is a treat to me on a recent visit to the establishment to witness the frolicsome gambols of a number of youths indulging in the luxury of a tepid bath. I could but not feel the importance of affording ample means of the enjoyment of this innocent and healthful amusement, and how desirable it was that such pleasures should take the place of dog fights, up and down fights, and drinking bouts amongst our working classes." So apart from his very Victorian concept of fun, what's important to remember is that this is a time when swimming, as we understand it, kind of started, and also later on the water polo. But people wouldn't swim in these pools per se. They would kind of just plunge in, dive in, come out, and just play. And one of the other things that happened in Sycamore Street, and we have reports about this, is that richer men would come and throw some coins in the water and then watch boys dive for them so that they could get them, it would keep the money. And we also know that there would be begging happening in front of the establishment, in front of the bath for the 2p. So children, young boys would beg for the 2p to kind of spend the day in the baths, if you like. And we know this because there were signs, we have signs forbidding this practice. So one of the things that interests me, because I'm a nerd, is what material would they use for the plunge pools? So we can see here, this one has got tiles. What we don't know is whether this actually held water very well. And if it didn't hold water very well, then it would be very expensive to run. So We know that Sycamore Street didn't really pay for itself. Miller Street didn't really pay for itself. Hardly any of the baths paid for themselves. So how did they do it? I don't know. It's just one of those questions that I have. Sycamore Street and Miller Street were for quite a while, they were the only public baths in Manchester. It was only after 1855 that the Manchester Baths and Laundries Company was founded. So Manchester Baths and Laundries Company was founded by a few philanthropists who actually thought, okay, let's scale this up, let's make this bigger, let's raise more money to build more bathhouses. Manchester Corporation at this time was just kind of building the Longdale Reservoir and the railways, so they just didn't have the capacity or the interest to do it themselves. So Manchester Baths and Laundries Company stepped in, and they followed a shareholders model. So the way that it was sold to the people of Manchester was that if you give us £5, you get shares in the business will make money. So it was always this idea that it would be self-sufficient, it would pay for itself. Now let's start this thing. They sold 7,000 shares of £5, which is a lot of money at the time, and it was a lot of people who had that money. So it must seem that there was an interest in creating baths and wash houses for the people. So the first bath that they built was on Collier Street in Salford. It's Greengate Bath. It's also, incidentally, the only one that is still standing in a manner of speaking. Can you see this? So the outside of it is still there, but it is falling down. There's a hole in the roof. Yes, it's very beautiful. It was very similar. All three of the establishments are quite similar to Victoria Baths in that they had a number of pools and a number of like washing facilities and laundries. So the second one is on New Store Street, it's Mayfield Baths. It was opened in 1856. No, 1857, sorry. And then Leaf Street Baths in Hume, which, like Victoria Baths, also had a Turkish bath, and this was built in 1860. Again, this had 3 pools. It was very popular, and it was there for over 100 years until it was pulled down in the slum clearances of the 1970s. So one of the problems that the Manchester Baths and Laundries Company was having, though, was that despite them promising their shareholders that it would make a profit, it didn't. Not really, not reliably. Partly because the fluctuations of the price of coal, and partly because, well, their clientele was poor, so they didn't really have a lot of money. And the 1860s also, it was an economic downturn, it was a depression, there was the cotton famine, there was the American Civil War. It was just not a great time for working class people, so a lot of them just didn't have the money to spare to take baths. That's why they didn't make any money. So this is the point where I'm going off a little bit on a tangent on public finance to explain why the Manchester Corporation didn't really build baths and wash houses until later on. So bear with me. Manchester didn't have a Board of Health, like I said, so they couldn't really petition the government for a loan to improve public health. It was also a new thing, so public health and all of the other municipal infrastructure, so like street paving or the railroads or drainage systems, actually were more expensive than it was when they set out, and it was horrifying ratepayers who were paying for this. So the project would start off small and then just spiral in cost. So a lot of ratepayers just didn't want to spend the money. They just didn't want to invest in a project where they just couldn't see an end to the public purse, I guess. So decisions in Manchester were made in King Street at the time, so this is the old town hall, until the 1870s when we moved into the new building, which is nice and shiny on Albert Square. Rates were the only way that Manchester Corporation could raise any funds. So ratepayers, it was based on the nominal value of property. So this would be a very small number of people who had rateable property. Business owners, bankers, merchants, and lawyers. The rates could also be levied for special purposes, for example, the poor rate, but it would still be the ratepayers who would pay for this. So the only reason partly the Longerdale scheme, for example, succeeded was because they had the profits from the gasworks to pay for it. Otherwise, it would never have got off the ground. Ratepayers were varied to pay for improvement projects which might spiral in cost. And because the ratepayers were also the people making the decisions in the town, these projects didn't get done. There's also, another thing to not forget is that there's a general overall underinvestment in cities at this time in the UK. Economic historians still argue about why this happened, but let's just say for now that there's three possible reasons, and it's probably a combination of those, which are capital market failure, public sector failure, and the fact that the public health technologies were still primitive at this time. All of them are equally plausible, but it really comes back to this question of who would pay for it and who would benefit from it. The only reason that sanitary reformers actually got sanitary reform sort of off the ground was that it would be worth it financially. Edwin Chadwick had many arguments about that it would be profitable to save lives because these workers could work more. So there's lots of calculations. We actually have numbers for the mid-Victorians where they calculated the value of life. And the arguments for sanitary reform were that it would be worth it for the rich, that it would be worth it for the poor, and that it would be worth it for the state. So the idea was that if we invest in sanitary reform, in the end, we're going to get more out of it. And this is how it was argued. Now, we know that Manchester didn't build a lot of sanitary projects. And overall in Lancashire, a lot of the conditions didn't change until the 1860s and 70s. So why did those projects fail? We know that there was a lot of health agitation, there was a lot of sanitary agitation, so what gives? There's still debate about exactly why this happened, but the public sector failure is much easier to argue. So, like I said, ratepayers were the ones that would make the decisions, but also they were the ones who would vote the people in the government into their positions, and this was the only way to influence sanitary reform at this time. And it was a tiny number of people who had a lot of power. And partly, they just didn't want high rates because it was bad for business. It was a time of free markets, it was a time of everything needs to be as cheap as possible. So it's no wonder that Manchester didn't really do anything about public health properly until the 1870s. So, one of the other aspects of the sanitary reform movement was the idea of cleanliness being next to godliness, which kind of reels me back into baths and wash houses. Yes, so this is a poster of the Manchester and Salford Sanitary Association, where James Dunn is giving a lecture on the evils of dirt and the value of cleanliness, which is kind of what I pinched for today. The idea of cleanliness being next to godliness was very entwined in Victorian thinking. So I'll just read you a few extracts of people talking about this issue. E.T. Bellhouse of Manchester Statistical Society writes in 1877, Mr. John Lee of Manchester thinks that if the home and the person be clean, the mind rises to an improved condition. Cleanliness, writes Mr. Lee, produces self-respect. With purer air and clean surroundings, the mind is less depressed and seeks less the excitement of drink. I should expect that greater temperance on greater cleanliness, that high mental cultivation would be sought, and that improvement in physical and sanitary condition, however slow, which it must always be, and whatever social measures are adopted, would inevitably attend the fulfillment of the benevolent object in view. P.P. Barley, the engineer of the model baths in London, writes in 1852, the physical condition of man is influenced by the circumstance of cleanliness of their dwellings, in their persons and apparel. To improve the physical and moral condition of these classes of the community, which form the great basis of society, and upon the condition of which depends the safety and well-being of the whole superstructure, must be an object of primary importance to the statesman as well as the philanthropist. And it is not assuming too much to assert that cleanliness of person and apparel are means essentially conducive to those important results. Cleanliness is the natural companion to order, and they are both handmaids of religion. So we can see that the idea of clean bodies and clean hearts, if you like, is very common in Victorian England. Now, this sanitary association was set up in 1853, and I'm just going to read you three of the objects that they had, and there's over 30, but I'll stick to three. So it was set up to promote the temperance, personal and domestic cleanliness, and to the laws of health in general. It was to give familiar and well illustrated lectures in schoolrooms and elsewhere. And it was to distribute short tracts written in plain language and given or lent to the poor by the clergy or other ministers of religion, school teachers, and the various agents of societies employed in the visiting districts. Its first address to the working classes, the association makes it rather clear what they thought of the working people. They say, "You are no doubt aware that you are living in a town which is generally considered unhealthy, and it will be our aim in this and future addresses to show you why it is so, and to point out that there are remedies to be applied. You must therefore give us your best attention and recollect that it is for your special good. It is not forced upon you, but offered you in the spirit of kindness." So it's quite a kind of paternalistic attitude. Sanitary reform, in this sense, you could argue, was very interested in creating clean, healthy, controllable subjects out of the working classes instead of dirty, degenerate cogs in a machine. So they really wanted people who would do their part for the economy, do their part for the country, and play their part in the empire. And it's very clear from the text at the time that this was kind of their thinking. So everybody had a station in life, and if you were clean, you were moral, you were more likely to do your part. And if you were dirty, you would more likely to go drinking, you would get in fights, and you wouldn't be very effective as a worker. So I'll show you some other of the posters to just give you an idea of what the Sanitary Association would have lectured about. So here we have a lecture by A.P. Childs on the use and abuse of malt liquors, wine and spirituous mixtures, and the influence of temperance and excess on health and the duration of life. There's one on The Sources or Origin of the Blood and Its Contamination by Bad Food and Bad Air by William Smith. There's also The Physical and Moral Evils Arising from Weather, Heat, Cold, Damp, Want of Light, Cellar and Court Residences, etc. by Dr. Allen. And, of course, Bathing and the Free Use of Water as a Means of Cleanliness, Personal and Domestic, and the Importance of Public Baths and Washhouses by James Dunn. So, baths and washhouses would obviously play a huge part in creating these clean subjects who would go swimming rather than go to the pub. There is definitely writing that links this cleanliness and spirituality. So we have Minister G. Dickinson from Edinburgh saying, God is to be worshipped with outward reverence as well as with inward devotion, with clean bodies and clean hearts. Therefore, the man who is careless in his outward demeanours is not rendering acceptable worship to God. There is a reciprocal influence between our bodies and our spiritual faculties. So much emphasis was put on this self-governing person to clean and thus help themselves. And this is partly why this association was set up with public lectures. So the idea is that you would go to the lecture to educate yourself and then do something about the situation you find yourself in. It's a very kind of self-help Victorian attitude. It was very common, and it was not, cleanliness was not the only area where this rhetoric would crop up. Again, we know that there was a discussion around cleanliness about clean people who work, dirty people who don't work, and don't play their part in the social machinery. So, as we have seen, public baths and washhouses give us an insight into what life was like in the 1830s and 40s, but also give us an insight into why Manchester Corporation didn't until the 1870s, when the Public Health Act actually cleaned up the financing of the situation. So they established Board of Health everywhere, have made everything compulsory, and they also released a load of money to pay for these things until the 1870s. So I'll finish with a quote from E.T. Bellhouse's address in 1877, where he talks about his hopes for the future now that the Manchester Corporation has taken over building baths and washhouses. He says, I feel confident that the useful work which the Manchester Corporation has at length taken in hand will be carried out with enlightened zeal and energy, and also that the neighbouring borough of Salford will shortly adopt the system in a similar spirit. A worthy arrangement and development of public baths and washhouses under corporate control will be an incalculable boon to the community. The known results in London, Birmingham, Liverpool and other large towns, with the experience of Manchester itself under very adverse circumstances, all point to this direction. Our vast masses of population, crowded in small dwellings and densely packed in narrow streets and alleys, need all the advantages that can be secured in the way of sanitary improvement.